Autumn of 2003, on a 240-acre property 12 kilometers east of Cochrane, Alberta, a 43-year-old woman named Beatrice Oland walked out to the far field her late husband had kept in Canola for 11 consecutive years and drove the first of 180 wooden stakes into the ground with a rubber mallet she had borrowed from the barn. Her daughter, Simone, watched from the kitchen window. Simone was 19 and had come home from the University of Calgary for the long weekend. She stayed an extra 4 days. She did not go back until she understood what her mother was doing. She left still, not entirely certain. The hired man, a quiet Métis farmer named Desmond who had worked the Oland property since Beatrice's husband Roy had been alive, sat in the cab of his half-ton at the edge of the field for 40 minutes before he climbed out. He did not take a stake. He did not take the mallet. He walked a rows his employer had already marked and said nothing for a long time. Mrs. Oland? Desmond. What are we marking? Tree rows. He looked across the field. The canola had come off 3 weeks before. The ground was black and dry and smelled the way Alberta field ground smells in October, which is like iron and cold and something just finished. He had walked this ground for 8 years. He had watched Roy Oland run it in canola and wheat on a 2-year rotation. And he had watched the yields come in reliably, and he had watched the operating note at the credit union in Cochrane get paid every December without drama. What kind of trees? Haskap and chokery to start, Saskatoon in the second planting. Desmond put his cap back on. He looked at the stakes she had already driven, straight north-south lines across 80 acres of what was the most productive canola ground in Rocky View County. Mrs. Oland, he said, and then he stopped. I know what you're going to say. I haven't said it yet. You're going to say Roy kept this in grain. He did. I know he did. He kept it in grain for 11 years, and the soil organic matter dropped every season, and he knew it was dropping, and he said he'd get to it, and then he didn't get to it because he got sick in 2001 and died in 2002, and now I'm getting to it. Desmond did not answer. He looked at the 80 acres, and then he looked at Beatrice Oland, who was 43 years old and had grown up on a mixed operation in the Peace River country, and who had a graduate certificate in agricultural science from Olds College that she had completed by correspondence between 1994 and 1997, while raising Simone and managing the household accounts and helping Roy through 3 bad crop years in a row. He had known her for 8 years. He had always suspected she knew more about the land than she had been asked to show. How many trees? 180 this year, another 90 in the spring if the first planting establishes. And the grain? Grain goes in the alleys. Same equipment, same rotation, except the alleys are 24-foot centers to give the canopy room by year 8. She had said this calmly. She had said it the way someone says a thing they have rehearsed many times in private. Desmond had heard Roy Oland talk about the farm the same way, the particular steadiness of a person who has already decided and is only now informing the world. He picked up a stake from the pile by the truck. Where do you want the next row? She told him. He drove it. They worked until it was too dark to see. The trees were ordered from a nursery in Strathmore, bare rootstock, selected for hardiness in Zone 3, paid for from a line of credit. Beatrice had opened in her name alone at the credit union in Cochrane 3 months after Roy's estate cleared probate. The credit manager, a man named Ed Poirier, who had been approving and declining farm operating notes in Rocky View County since 1988, had looked at the application and looked at Beatrice Oland across the desk and asked what the credit line was for. Perennial fruit establishment. On the Oland Quarter? On the South 80 of the Oland Quarter, yes. Ed Poirier leaned back. He had known Roy Oland. He had approved Roy Oland's operating notes for 6 years. He had liked Roy, and he had liked the reliability of the canola and wheat rotation because it was a rotation he understood and could value and could explain to his regional manager in Calgary without having to define terms. Mrs. Oland, I want to be straight with you. The Oland Quarter is valued on our books as Class 2 grain land. Perennial fruit is a different risk category. I'm aware of that. Fruit establishment has a 5 to 7 year window before commercial production. That's 5 to 7 years of carrying costs with no fruit income, during which the grain alleys will continue to produce. I have a projection if you'd like to see it. He would like to see it. She slid it across the desk. It was 11 pages, single-spaced, with footnotes that cited research from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, from the Vineland Research and Innovation Centre in Ontario, and from a long-term intercropping study conducted at the University of Saskatchewan between 1991 and 2001. Ed Poirier read the executive summary. He turned to page 4. He turned back to page 2. He looked up. "You wrote this yourself?" "Over the winter, yes." He approved the credit line. He was not certain he was right to do it, but he approved it. And he drove home that evening and told his wife that Roy Oland's widow was going to plant fruit trees in the best canola ground in Rocky View County. And he could not decide whether she was exceptionally smart or exceptionally grief-struck, and his wife, who had met Beatrice Oland twice at community suppers, said those two things were not mutually exclusive. The nursery truck arrived on a Thursday morning in mid-May, with 180 bare root plants packed in damp burlap, and Beatrice and Desmond worked from 6 in the morning until 7 at night over 4 days to get them all in the ground. Simone drove out from Calgary on the Friday to help and dug 47 of the holes herself with a borrowed post-hole auger and developed blisters on both palms and did not complain once. The trees went into rows at 10-foot spacing with end rows and 24-foot centers between rows. Every tree mulched with straw brought from a feed operation east of Airdrie. By the end of May, the little gray-brown sticks were standing in their rows across the 80-acre field, and the canola had been seeded in the alleys and was already showing green. The news moved through Cochrane the way news moves through small Alberta towns, which is not slowly at all. The man at the co-op in town heard it from the seed rep, who heard it from the nursery driver. The seed rep mentioned it to 2 other clients. One of those clients mentioned it to his brother-in-law, who sat on the Rocky View County Agricultural Services Board. Within 6 weeks of planting, 4 people in particular had heard enough to have opinions. The first was the seed rep himself, a man named Bruce who had serviced the Oland account for 4 years and who believed genuinely and without malice that what Beatrice was doing was going to end with a bank calling a note. Bruce sold canola seed for a living, and he had built his understanding of that 80-acre field entirely around what it would produce in canola on a good year, which was between 42 and 48 bushels per acre, and he could not make the numbers work any other way. He did not confront Beatrice. He simply mentioned to other clients as a cautionary note that the Oland widow had planted fruit trees in her grain field, and he said it the way people say things they believe they are saying kindly. The second was a man named Gareth Tullis, who farmed 600 acres of grain in the next township and who had been one of Roy Oland's closest friends. Gareth was 58, a third-generation grain farmer whose grandfather had broken sod in the Cochrane area in 1929, and he believed, with the certainty of someone who had never had reason to question it, that mixed perennial operations were for hobby farmers and retirement properties and not for people who were serious about making a living from the land. He drove over one afternoon in June to see the planting for himself. He stood at the field edge. He looked at the rows of haskap sticks in the black alleys between the young canola. He did not say anything for a while. "Bay," he said finally. "Gareth, Roy would have never done this. I know that. This is Class 2 grain land. It's Class 2 land with a 23% decline in organic matter since 1992. Roy tracked it himself. I have his notebooks." Gareth Tullis did not know about the notebooks. He looked at the field. He wanted to say something else, but he was not certain what it was. He left without saying it. He drove back to his own 600 acres and seeded the third of 4 canola blocks he had planned for the season and did not mention the visit to anyone, which meant he mentioned it to everyone he knew within the week, because Gareth Tullis had never successfully kept a thought inside his own head for longer than 4 days. The third person was a woman named Patricia Stoll, who chaired the Rocky View County Agricultural Services Board and had been farming with her husband in the county for 31 years. Patricia was precise and organized and had an economist's habit of reducing every farming decision to its simplest financial term. She had seen operations fail because of complexity, and she had seen operations survive because of simplicity, and she had, over 31 years, developed a strong prior towards simplicity. She was not unkind. She simply believed that a 43-year-old widow with a grain operation and an outstanding credit line was not the ideal candidate for an 8-year establishment project with no precedent in Rocky View County. She called Beatrice in July. "I want to be sure you have the support you need," Patricia said. "These kinds of decisions after a loss like yours, sometimes the county can help connect people with financial planning resources." "I appreciate that," Beatrice said. "The board has been hearing some discussion about the planting." "I imagine it has." "There's concern, not criticism, concern." "The concern is noted." Patricia Stoll waited. She had expected more resistance or more gratitude, one or the other. She had not expected the calm. "Mrs. Oland, have you spoken with an agrologist?" "I have a graduate certificate in agricultural science. I wrote 11 years of the Oland Farm soil testing reports. I've been in correspondence with 2 researchers at the University of Saskatchewan for 7 months. I appreciate the board's concern, Patricia. The trees are in the ground." Patricia Stoll hung up the phone and sat at her kitchen table for a few minutes before she went back to her accounts. She was not sure what had just happened. She had intended to help. She still believed she had been trying to help. She was also, in a way she would not have admitted to anyone for another 5 years, slightly shaken. The 4th person was Beatrice's own brother, a man named Calvin Oland, who farmed his half of the original Oland family quarter outside of Rocky Mountain House, and who had never entirely agreed with Roy's decision to consolidate the Cochrane acreage in Beatrice's name at the time of their father's estate. Calvin was 47, quieter than Gareth Tullis but no less certain, and he drove down in August of that first year, not to criticize but to see, and he stood in the field at the edge of a canola alley and looked at the haskap plants, which were now 18 inches tall and leafed out and clearly alive and establishing, and he looked at the canola, which was heading and golden and healthy, and he did not say what he had come to say. What he had come to say was that he would buy the Cochrane quarter at a fair price if Beatrice was finding the operation too much to manage alone. He had said a version of this at Roy's funeral. He had said it again at Christmas. He did not say it in August because the field was not what he had expected the field to look like, and Calvin Oland was honest enough to know when a field looked good. He asked Desmond how the canola was coming. Desmond told him 44 bushels per acre on the alley ground in September. Calvin drove back to Rocky Mountain House and did not make the offer. Here is what Beatrice Oland knew that the seed rep and Gareth Tullis and Patricia Stoll and Calvin did not know, and what she had been carrying in a blue 3-ring binder on her kitchen desk since February of 2003, when she had made the decision over the course of 8 weeks in the evenings after Simone had gone back to university and the house was quiet. She knew that haskap berries, the blue honeysuckle variety developed for prairie hardiness, began producing commercial quantities in year 3 and reached full commercial production by year 5, 2 years earlier than the timeline Ed Pori at the credit union had been told to expect. She knew this because she had read every published study from the fruit program at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's Beaver Lodge Research Station, and she had written to the program lead twice and received detailed responses both times. She knew that fruit tree root systems and annual grain root systems occupied completely different soil horizons, the grain in the top 14 inches, the haskap and chokecherry descending past 3 feet by year 2, and that the competition between them was minimal during the grain's critical periods. She knew that the shade cast by haskap plants at maturity in 24-foot alleys would affect less than 6% of the grain's solar exposure during the peak photosynthesis window. She knew that the soil organic matter loss she had watched happen under 11 years of continuous canola was reversible, and that the decomposing leaf litter and root exudates of a perennial planting could begin measurably improving that organic matter within 4 years. She had Roy's own soil tests to prove what the baseline was. She intended to run them every 2 years. She had scheduled the first retest for the fall of 2005. She had not shared the binder with anyone except Simone, who had read half of it in March and asked 3 questions and gone back to Calgary with the conviction that her mother knew exactly what she was doing. A conviction that was both correct and somewhat terrifying. The first season's canola came off in September at 44 bushels per acre on the alley ground, which was 2 bushels below the field average from Roy's best years, but well within commercial range given that the alleys represented only 70% of the original field acreage. Beatrice wrote the number in Roy's old ledger, which she had continued using because it had 12 pages left, and because she saw no reason to waste a ledger. The haskap plants went dormant in October without losing a single one, all 180 established. She noted this as well. The second year, 2004, was wet. The canola alley yield came in at 39 bushels below target, affected by the same excessive moisture that reduced yields across the region. But the haskap grew 22 inches in their second season. By October, they were carrying visible bud set that Beatrice had been watching since August. She pruned them in November, alone, in the cold that comes to the Cochrane foothills in mid-autumn, with a pair of bypass pruners she had brought from her mother's farm in the Peace River country. Desmond found her in the third row on a Tuesday morning. He had not known she was out there. He had not expected to see her working the trees because they were small, and he had not yet entirely believed in them. He watched her for a few minutes from the end of the row. She was working quickly and carefully, taking the crossing branches first, then opening the center. "What are you taking out?" he asked. She showed him. She explained the reasoning. He asked 2 more questions in the next hour. By noon, he was working the lower scaffold branches of the trees she had not yet reached, carefully asking before each cut. They pruned 188 haskap plants in 2 days. Desmond did not say anything about it afterward, and neither did she. In March of 2005, Ed Poirier called and asked her to come in to review the credit line. She came. She brought the binder. She brought the updated soil test results from the fall retest, which showed a statistically measurable improvement in organic carbon in the alley ground adjacent to the tree rows compared to the control strip she had maintained in the northeast corner. She had had the tests done at a certified lab in Calgary, and she had attached the lab certification to the front of the report. "The organic matter is improving," she said, placing the report on his desk. He picked it up. He read the summary. He looked up. 2 years in. 2 years in, yes. The projection was 4 years for measurable improvement. The alley ground is ahead of schedule. Ed Poirier looked at the numbers. He had worked in agricultural lending for 17 years. He had approved and declined hundreds of operating notes and credit lines for farms of every description. And he had learned across those 17 years to read the difference between a farmer who was performing and a farmer who was hoping. He could not find the hoping in Beatrice Oland's report. He found only the performing. He renewed the credit line. He offered her an increased limit for the spring planting. She accepted the increase for 90 additional Saskatoon berry plants she had already planned and already knew the price of and had already selected the rootstock for, from the nursery in Strathmore. The third season, 2005, brought the first fruit. 61 of the haskap plants produced berries. The yield was small, perhaps 300 kilograms across the whole planting, and Beatrice sold none of it commercially. She processed it. She ran the berries through a hand press her father had used in the Peace River country for Saskatoons 30 years before. She made 48 jars of haskap jam on the stove in the farmhouse kitchen on a Saturday in August with Simone, who had driven out from Calgary with her boyfriend, a landscape architecture student named Owen who had never picked a berry in his life and who picked 80 kilograms of haskap by the end of that afternoon without being asked twice. The canola alley yield that year was 43 bushels. Beatrice wrote it in the ledger. She also wrote the soil organic carbon reading from the August retest, which had improved another half point since the March test. Gareth Tullis heard about the jam. He had not expected jam. He had expected the operation to be foundering by year 3. The jam bothered him in a way he could not entirely explain to his wife when she asked why he was quiet at supper. In the winter of 2005 to 2006, Calvin came at Christmas and walked the field with Beatrice in the snow. The haskap plants were dormant and full-framed now, nearly 4 feet tall, standing in their north-south rows across the white field, with their gray branches catching the low Alberta sun. Calvin walked the length of one row. He stopped and looked at the nearest plant for a moment. "These are bigger than I expected," he said. "They grow faster than most people think." How many survived? All 188 from the first planting. The 90 Saskatoons from last spring lost 3 to vole damage. What's the canola doing? 43 bushels last season. The alley soil is outperforming the control strip by a measurable margin now. Calvin looked at the row for another moment. He did not say anything about buying the quarter. He had not said it since August of 2004, when the canola had come in at 39 bushels, and he had calculated in his head that the operation would be under serious pressure by year 4. The operation was not under serious pressure by year 4. He recalculated nothing because there was nothing left in his calculation that he trusted. He went back inside and had coffee and asked about Simone, and Beatrice told him about the landscape architecture student, and Calvin said nothing critical about that either, which was how Beatrice knew something had shifted in her brother. The first real commercial harvest came in 2006, the fourth year. Beatrice picked 1,800 kilograms of haskap from the established planting. She had arranged 3 sales channels the previous winter, a direct supply agreement with a specialty food distributor in Calgary, who supplied farmers markets and independent grocery stores across southern Alberta, a U-pick arrangement for 4 designated rows that she had advertised on a single sheet of paper posted at the co-op in Cochrane, and a processing arrangement with a small jam and preserve operation in Canmore that had been looking for a consistent local haskap supply for 2 years. The gross from the fruit in 2006 was $14,200. The Canola alley yield came in at 46 bushels, the highest alley yield since the trees went in, because the soil organic matter improvement was now measurably affecting moisture retention in the top horizon. She wrote both numbers in the ledger. She did not tell anyone what the combined per-acre gross was compared to the county average for straight grain. She knew what it was. She paid the credit line in full in December and did not take another draw until April. Bruce, the seed rep, heard about the fruit income from the co-op manager, who had seen the U-pick sign. Bruce did the math on the back of a call sheet in his truck. He sat in the parking lot for a few minutes. He was not a dishonest man. He was a man who had been wrong and who knew it now, and who was not yet certain what to do with that knowledge. In the spring of 2007, Patricia Stoll contacted Beatrice, not through the Agricultural Services Board this time. She called on a Saturday morning from her own kitchen. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know I am not asking on behalf of the board." "All right." "My husband and I have 40 acres of the East Quarter that we have been running in wheat for 12 years, and the yield has been declining for 4. I have been reading about what you've been doing. I would like to come and see the operation." Beatrice said she was welcome anytime. Patricia came on a Tuesday. She brought a notebook. She spent 4 hours in the field with Beatrice and Desmond. She did not ask soft questions. She asked about soil horizon root competition, about pruning schedules, about the capital cost of establishment per acre, about the break-even timeline under 3 different yield scenarios. Beatrice answered every question. She showed her the binder. She showed her the soil test progression. She showed her Roy's original baseline numbers from 1992. Patricia left with photographs and 12 pages of notes and called Beatrice twice more that week with follow-up questions. She planted 60 haskap plants on 8 acres of the East Quarter in May of 2008. She did not tell the Agricultural Services Board she was doing this until the planting was already in. The summer of 2008 was the hardest summer Beatrice had faced since Roy's death. In June, Desmond was diagnosed with a degenerative condition in his left hip that made walking the field rows impossible. He did not leave. He drove the tractor for the canola operation sitting sideways on the seat with a cushion under his hip. He managed the spray equipment. He could not walk the tree rows, and he could not bend to work at ground level. Beatrice worked the tree rows herself. She pruned 270 plants in 2 days in November 2007, alone, in -12 degrees, and she did it again in November 2008, alone, except that on the second afternoon, Simone arrived unannounced with Owen, who was now her fiancé, and who had apparently been keeping a private count of the hours his future mother-in-law was spending in the field by herself, and who had driven out from Calgary on a Wednesday afternoon without telling Simone why until they were already on the highway. "I'd like to learn how to do this properly," he said, standing at the end of the first row with his hands in his jacket pockets. Beatrice looked at him for a moment. "It's -12. I brought gloves." She handed him the bypass pruners and showed him the first cut. He made 4 bad cuts before he made a good one. She corrected each one without comment and showed him the right cut again. By the 3rd tree, he was finding the crossing branches himself. By the end of the row, he was asking about the center opening cuts. They worked until dark. Simone hauled brush. The 2008 canola alley yield came in at 43 bushels per acre in a county where the regional average that year was 38, because the late-season moisture stress that reduced yields across Rocky View County was partially mitigated by what the haskap root systems had been doing to the water table in the alley soil for 6 years. The haskap harvest that year was 3,100 kilograms. Income from fruit $22,800. Combined per acre gross from the 80-acre planting, more than 3 times the county grain average. Beatrice paid the remaining balance of the original credit line in November 2008. She wrote the zero balance in Roy's ledger on the same page where she had recorded the first operating note draw in February 2003. She closed the ledger. She put it in the drawer where Roy had always kept it. She opened a new one. The men who had passed the cautionary notes around Cochrane in 2003 and 2004 had mostly stopped mentioning the Oland place by 2007. Gareth Tullis had stopped mentioning it in 2006 after the UPIC had drawn people past his field road on 2 consecutive August Saturdays. He had watched the cars go by. He had not gone himself. In 2009, the Calgary Herald ran a feature on haskap production in Alberta. The reporter, a young woman 2 years out of journalism school, had heard about the Oland operation from the specialty food distributor in Calgary and had driven out to Cochrane on a Thursday morning to see it. The article ran on a Saturday in October. It was not long. It quoted Beatrice 4 times. The longest quote was 14 words. The reporter had asked her what she would tell someone considering a similar planting. "Start with 40 plants on your worst performing grain ground," Beatrice said. "Learn the pruning before you scale." The article was picked up by 2 agricultural trade publications in November. By the following spring, Beatrice had received 67 letters and emails from farmers across Alberta, Saskatchewan, and 3 from Manitoba. She answered every one. Gareth Tullis read the article at his kitchen table on a Saturday morning. He read it twice. He put it down and looked out the window at his 600 acres of grain and did not say anything to his wife for a while. He called Beatrice on a Monday. "I want to come see the operation," he said. "If that's all right." "It's all right." He came on a Thursday. He was 64 years old. He had farmed grain in Rocky View County his entire adult life. He walked the haskap rows with Beatrice in October, the plants in their 6th full year, leafing out in yellow and red, and looking like nothing that had ever grown in a canola field in his experience. He walked the entire south block. He did not speak for a long time. "What's the organic matter doing?" he asked finally. She told him. She showed him the 5 test cycles since 2003. He read each number. The ground Roy was running at 23% below baseline, 23.4. And now, back to 1992 levels on the tree row adjacent strips. The alley centers are 2 years behind that. Gareth looked at the nearest plant. It was 5 feet tall and full scaffolded and carried the bud set of the previous season's fruit in its old wood. "I should have come in 2003, he said. "You came now." "I came when the newspaper told me to." "Most people need the newspaper." He looked at her. He was not sure whether she was being generous or simply honest. He decided she was being both. "Roy was my friend for 20 years, he said. "I thought I was looking out for you." "I know you did." "I wasn't looking out for you. I was looking out for the version of the farm I already understood." Beatrice did not answer. She had thought this exact thought many times about many of the people who had called and visited and quietly predicted failure between 2003 and 2006. She had never said it to any of them. There was no version of saying it that added anything to what the field itself had already said. Gareth asked if he could bring a couple of his field soil test records next time and compare them with hers. She said yes. He came back twice that winter with the records. On the 3rd visit, he brought his son, a man in his early 30s who had recently taken over the operational management of the Tullis acreage. The son had more questions than Gareth. He stayed 3 hours. Beatrice and Desmond continued working the operation through the 2010 season. Desmond's hip had been replaced in January of 2009, and he was mobile again, though not at the pace he had been before. Owen, who had married Simone in August of 2008 in the yard of the Cochrane property, had taken a position with a landscape firm in Airdrie and drove out most weekends. He had become, without any formal arrangement, the person responsible for the UPIC operation and for the direct relationship with the Calgary distributor. He had also become, over 3 November pruning seasons, a competent hand in the haskap rows, not fast but careful, and he asked good questions. Simone and Owen's first child was born in March of 2010. They named her Ruth. Beatrice drove to Calgary on a Wednesday and held her granddaughter in the hospital room and drove back Thursday to check the early haskap bud development, which was running 10 days ahead of schedule because the winter had been mild. In October of 2011, Beatrice was invited to present at the Alberta Sustainable Agriculture Conference in Red Deer. She was 51 years old. She had not spoken publicly before. She almost declined. Simone drove out and sat at the kitchen table and made the case over 2 cups of coffee. Beatrice said yes. She stood at a podium in a conference room in Red Deer in front of 340 people, most of them farmers or agrologists or agricultural lenders, with one index card in her jacket pocket. She read it once before she went to the podium, put it back, and spoke without it. I planted haskap in my canola field in 2003, and for 3 years everyone in my county said I was going to lose the farm, she said. I want to be precise about what they were actually worried about. They were not worried about me. They were worried about the field. Specifically, they were worried that I was going to use Class 2 grain land in a way that their operating model couldn't account for. She paused. The model they were using was the model that had been running that field since 1956, grain on grain on grain. Canola and wheat and canola and wheat. Roy's father started it. Roy continued it. The organic matter declined every year for 47 years, and everyone knew it was declining, and nobody changed anything because the model said grain, and the lending said grain, and the insurance said grain, and the habit said grain. She looked at the room. I changed it because my father ran a mixed operation in the Peace River country, and I had watched him do it for 20 years, and I understood what the land was trying to tell him that it was also trying to tell the Cochrane Quarter. The land was not built for one crop. It was built for relationships between things, between shallow roots and deep roots, between annual turnover and perennial establishment, between what the soil can give in the short run and what it can give across 40 years if you ask it the right questions. She paused. In 2008, the county grain average was 38 bushels per acre. My alley ground came in at 43 because the haskap root systems had been modifying the soil moisture profile for 5 years. That wasn't luck. That was 5 years of the land responding to a different question. She stepped back from the podium. The room was quiet for a moment, and then it wasn't. Gareth Tullis was in the room. He had driven down from Cochrane that morning with his son. He found Beatrice in the lobby afterward, standing with Simone and Owen, who was holding Ruth, who was 18 months old and entirely occupied with a paper name tag she had pulled off her father's jacket. Mrs. Oland, Gareth said. Gareth. He was 66, and he had been farming grain in Rocky View County for 43 years, and he looked like a man who had recently settled something with himself. I want to say something I should have said in 2003. You don't have to. I do. I should have walked out to that field in the spring of 2003 and said I don't understand what you're doing, but I know you're not a person who does things without understanding them. I didn't say that. I said the other thing instead. You said what made sense with what you knew. I knew you, Bea. I'd known you for 8 years. That should have been enough. She looked at him. She had known Gareth Tullis long enough to know that this cost him something. She knew how to accept it without making it cost more. You asked to see the operation in 2009, she said. You brought your son. He asked the right questions. I think Roy would have counted that as the answer. Gareth nodded. He shook Owen's hand and looked at Ruth and shook Simone's hand, which was not what he meant to do, but which Simone accepted without comment, because she had grown up watching her mother extend grace to people who had arrived late to deserving it. He drove back to Cochrane that afternoon. His son, in the passenger seat, did not say much for the first 30 kilometers. Then he asked his father what the haskap operations combined per acre gross had been in 2010. Gareth told him. His son was quiet again for a few minutes. We should look at the East 40, his son said. I know we should, Gareth said. Desmond retired in 2013, quietly at his own insistence, 3 days before Christmas. Beatrice drove him home after his last day and sat in his driveway for a few minutes and thanked him. He said he had just followed the rows she laid out. She said that was not nothing. He did not disagree. The Cochrane Quarter stayed in the family trust Beatrice had established in 2006, the same year she paid the credit line in full. The trust named Simone as primary heir and included a 90-year clause restricting the property from sale outside the direct Oland line. Owen managed the commercial operations. Ruth, who was 12 years old in 2022 and who had been walking haskap rows with her grandmother since she was old enough to walk rows, could name every variety on the property by plant and by flavor. The 80-acre planting in 2022 contained 270 haskap plants, 90 saskatoons, and 40 chotertiaries that Beatrice had added in 2014 for processing diversity. The canola alley still ran every spring on a rotation with winter rye cover crop. The soil organic carbon on the planting block had returned to 1985 levels, before Roy's father's last decade of continuous grain. The same 80 acres that Ed Poirier had valued on the credit union's books as Class 2 canola ground at $180,000 in 2003 was assessed at $940,000 in 2003, an increase that reflected both the land market and what the land had become. The comparable straight grain quarters in Rocky View County had appreciated, across the same period, at roughly half that rate. Beatrice Oland turned 63 in 2023. She still walked the haskap rows every spring, checking the bud development and looking for winter damage, in the particular way her father had taught her to walk an orchard row when she was 10 years old in the Peace River country, slowly, without a purpose other than paying attention. In the early morning before the wind came up, and while the light was still low enough to see the detail in the branches. The field her husband had kept in canola for 11 years was not the same field anymore. It was not a worse field. It was a different field, one that had been asked a different question for 20 years and had answered in the way that land answers when you give it enough time to remember what it knows. She had driven the first stake into that ground on a Tuesday morning in October 2003, with a rubber mallet borrowed from the barn. She had done it because her father had taught her that no acre should spend its whole life doing one thing, and because Roy's notebook said the ground was declining, and because she had read the research and written the projection and decided, in the way a person decides after a long winter of looking at the evidence, that she knew what the field needed even if nobody else in Rocky View County believed it yet. She had been right. The field had known she was right before anyone else did. I think about the October morning Beatrice drove that first stake into the canola ground, and I wonder how many people in her position would have stopped before the mallet came down. Not because the idea was wrong, because the weight of everyone else's certainty is a real thing, and it presses on you in ways that have nothing to do with whether you are right or wrong. What stayed with me about Beatrice's story is not the yield numbers, though the numbers matter. It's the sequence of how she did it. She did not act out of desperation or grief or stubbornness alone. She acted out of knowledge she had built carefully over years, research she had gathered and tested and documented, and a kind of honesty about the land that the people around her had stopped practicing so long ago they had forgotten they ever had it. That is not luck. That is something you choose to cultivate in yourself, the same way you cultivate ground, slowly, with attention, with a willingness to retest what you think you know. There is a version of Beatrice's story where she fails. It is not a far-fetched version. She was a widow with an outstanding credit line and 180 bare root plants in a county where nobody had done what she was doing. The margin for error was real. What kept her inside it was not hope exactly. It was the discipline to keep reading the evidence accurately, to keep the soil test records Roy had started and continue them even when the results were uncomfortable, to write the 11-page projection and put the footnotes in and know that the footnotes were right. Integrity works like that, I think. It is not a feeling. It is a practice. It is what you do with the information when there is no one watching and no one applauding. And then there is Desmond, who stayed on that farm when his hip was failing and drove the tractor sideways with a cushion under him because leaving did not seem like the right thing to do. And Owen, who showed up on a Wednesday in -12 and asked to learn the pruning cuts and stayed until dark. The people around Beatrice who held when holding was hard. They were not obligated to hold. They chose it, and that choice is its own kind of character, the quiet kind that does not announce itself. I think what the canola field in Rocky View County was really measuring, across 20 years, was not just soil organic carbon. It was the compound effect of doing the right thing consistently, when nobody was confirming that you should. Beatrice knew the research. She held the line at the credit union desk. She pruned 270 plants alone in the cold. She answered 67 letters on a typewriter in the evenings. Every one of those acts was small. None of them were easy. All of them were deliberate. Gareth Tullis came to see the field, 6 years too late, and he knew it, and he said so. That honesty cost him something, and he paid it anyway. I respect that more than I can explain. It is hard to stand in a field that proved you wrong and say the words clearly. Most people find a way not to. The field did not forgive or refuse. It just kept showing what it had become. That, I think, is what perseverance actually looks like when you strip the drama off it. Not a single act of courage, 1,000 ordinary mornings of choosing to keep going because the evidence still says you are right, and because the land, if you ask it the right questions, will eventually answer in a way that even the skeptics cannot argue with.